Now, usually I try to stay away from political topics because I find they're not quite straightforward, and I tend to be sort of behind on the popular topics. But since being asked my opinion on the matter, I thought this could be an interesting video. Thank you, Greg, for the suggestion. Now, first off, let's talk about the tragedies. Mass shootings. Now, this may be surprising to hear, but these only account for about 1% of all firearm-related deaths. So, statistically, they're insignificant. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an issue and it should be addressed, but it's a small part of a bigger issue. So, basing gun laws around mass shootings isn't what we should be aiming for, because that's not representative of the problem as a whole. But what does account for the significant amounts of firearm-related deaths? Well, more than 60% are suicides, and around a third are homicides. Now, depending on what year you look at, there's about twice as many suicides as there are homicides. And it should also be noted that handguns are the biggest issue by far, and not so much with long guns. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, what's everyone else doing about it? I mean, from what I can see, it looks like the United States is the highest economically advanced country as far as the rate of firearm-related deaths, especially when it comes to suicides. But as far as firearm-related homicides specifically, only Mexico is ahead of us. Again, only considering economically advanced countries. So, we're talking about gun laws. How do these gun laws compare? Well, for Mexico, the gun laws are actually, well, they seem a bit strict on paper, but in actuality, they're not very well enforced and easily circumvented, so it's kind of lax there. But in every other first world country, the gun laws are pretty strict, and there's not nearly as many people dying firearm-related deaths. But we don't even have to look at other countries. We can look just within the United States, because the states individually have different gun laws that are stricter or looser. So let's look at how some individual states compare. So using this list I found on Wikipedia, we can see that the state with the highest rate of firearm-related deaths is Alaska. So if we look at the gun laws in Alaska, we can see that you need no permit to purchase, you don't need to register your firearm, there's no assault weapon law, you don't need a license, you don't need a permit to carry either concealed or openly, local governments cannot make anything more strict, they don't restrict NFA weapons, no peaceable journey laws, and no background checks required for private sales. This is pretty much as lax as it gets. Next up is Louisiana, where I live. You do not need a permit to purchase, you do not need to register your firearm, no owner's license, you do need a permit for concealed carry, but you can openly carry as much as you want. No assault weapon laws, no magazine capacity restrictions, no NFA weapon restrictions, and no background checks required for private sales. So again, pretty lax. The next worst state is Alabama, and looking at their laws, you do not need a permit to purchase, do not need to register, no owner license, you do need a permit for concealed carry, but open carry is pretty permissible, local governments cannot restrict them anymore, no law on assault weapons, no NFA weapons restrictions except for those disguised as walking canes, and no background checks required for private sales. So still pretty easy to purchase, own, and carry a firearm. Up next is Mississippi, in which you do not need a permit to purchase, you do not need to register, there's no assault weapon laws, you do not need a license to own, no permit required for concealed carry depending on how you do it, you can carry openly, and of course they preempt local restrictions. NFA weapons are not restricted as long as they comply with federal regulations, and no background checks required for private sales. So again, pretty easy to purchase, own, and carry a firearm. So now let's start looking at the best states with the lowest overall firearm death rates, starting with the absolute best, Hawaii. Hawaii requires a permit to purchase. You do need to register your firearm. There is an assault weapon law on handguns banning certain features. There's a magazine capacity restriction on handguns. You do not need a license to own them, but again, you do need to register any firearms. You do need a permit for the concealed carry of a handgun, and those permits are virtually never given out. You can openly carry a long gun, but you do need a license to openly carry a handgun, and those licenses are rarely given out. They did preempt local restrictions, but the laws are already pretty strict, as we can see. They've restricted NFA weapons, and they do require background checks for private sales. The next best state is Massachusetts, in which they require a permit to purchase. You do not need to register your firearm. They do require a license to own. You do need a license for concealed carry and open carry. There is little preemption of local restrictions. They do have some banned features. They have restricted the magazine capacity, they've restricted NFA weapons, and they require background checks for private sales. The next best state is New York. They require a permit to purchase a handgun. You need to register handguns. You need a license to own a handgun. You need a concealed carry permit for handguns. There are assault weapon laws. Magazine capacity restrictions. Title II NFA weapons are restricted. You cannot openly carry a loaded handgun, so that means you have to have a concealed carry permit. They haven't preempted any local restrictions except handgun licensing, and they require background checks for private sales, so it seems like their laws are pretty strict. The next best state is Connecticut, and in Connecticut you are required to have a permit to purchase. You kinda have to register firearms. There are assault weapon laws, magazine capacity restrictions. You don't need a license to own, but again, a permit to purchase. They do require carry permits. You even need a license to open carry. You need a permit to carry a loaded weapon in a vehicle. No NFA weapon restrictions. They do require background checks for private sales, and police can get a warrant to seize guns from anyone posing an imminent risk of harming himself or anyone else. I could keep going here, but you see the trend. Now, there are some notable exceptions, namely Texas and the District of Columbia. Now, Texas has some pretty loose gun laws, as you would expect, but they don't have that high of a rate of firearm-related deaths. And the District of Columbia is the opposite. They have what seems to be the strictest gun laws, and they have, by far, the highest rate of firearm-related deaths. But it looks like these are just the exceptions to the rules, and it also goes to highlight the fact that gun laws aren't the only variables at play, because they can be explained. Now in Texas, while their gun laws are lax, there's actually significantly fewer gun owners relative to the population than in states that are doing worse than Texas. And the District of Columbia is insanely densely populated, far more than any other state, and that is another factor, as are socioeconomic factors. Not to mention that they have a higher overall homicide rate, as well as crime rate in general. Now, since gun laws aren't the only variables at play, there's more than we can do than just changing gun laws. But it's pretty safe to say that most of the things that we've tried throughout US history hasn't actually worked. But there are some interventional programs that do show some promise, that target specific issues, especially in high crime areas. But looking at the correlation, it's pretty clear to see that the stricter the gun laws are in an area, the less people there are dying firearm-related deaths. But correlation doesn't mean causation, right? So what do the studies have to say about it? I looked it up, and it seems like the studies are kind of all over the place. That's because this isn't an easy thing to study, it's not straightforward. There are many different methods that you can use to go about it, and it's kind of difficult to control for all of the variables. So it's pretty easy to find studies that point either way, either saying gun laws are good, or gun laws are bad, or unnecessary. But overall, looking at all of the evidence, it seems like most studies are saying that stricter gun laws are beneficial. And that's especially illustrated in studies that look at specific gun laws, because some gun laws are better than others. They found in particular that gun laws that sort of restrict access to guns, including stricter background checks, waiting periods, and requiring a secure place to keep your gun in your home, these things are the best at reducing firearm-related deaths, especially when it comes to suicides. Because like I said, suicide is twice the issue that homicide is. And these studies show that the less households have firearms, then the less households there are committing suicide by firearm. Somebody who lives in a household that has a firearm in it is about 3 or 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And this is because suicide attempts tend to be a bit impulsive, and the feeling goes away after a while. And if you have a firearm, that's a pretty quick, easy, and effective way of doing it. Now, to be perfectly clear, between those households that have no firearms and the households that do have firearms, the rates of suicides by means other than a firearm is the same, meaning that the introduction of a firearm to the house makes somebody living in it far more likely to commit suicide overall. It's not that they would have used another method if they didn't have a gun. So the findings show that the less households there are, the less people there are committing suicide, not only just by guns, but overall. There is also evidence that stricter laws reduce gun-related homicide, especially particular laws, with some laws not necessarily helping much. Now, it should also be said that these laws need proper enforcement. If these laws aren't properly enforced, then it really doesn't do much of any good. So, it seems to me that stricter gun laws are the way to go, and that's how I feel. But obviously, there are people who disagree with me, and they have arguments of their own, so I'm now going to respond to some of the most common that I've heard. Now, the most annoying argument that I've heard is that if guns are illegal, then criminals are still going to have guns, they're just going to get them illegally. Well, yeah, criminals do break the law, but that's kind of the point. If the law is properly enforced, then those who own guns illegally will be prosecuted. We shouldn't keep ourselves from making laws on the grounds that criminals don't follow laws. Otherwise, why is murder illegal? We should make it legal to kill everyone, since criminals are still going to kill people, so why make it illegal for the people who want to do it for the right reasons? Now, this argument makes a lot more sense if it's elaborated on. The argument is that criminals are still going to have guns illegally, and law-abiding citizens aren't going to have guns for self-defense. Now, that makes a lot more sense. You want to be able to defend yourself. But here's the thing, I think it was just 2%. 2% of all violent crimes where the victim used a gun. That's 2% of violent crimes where a gun owner used a gun to protect himself. You want to keep loose gun laws, which has been shown to increase the amount of gun deaths for that 2% of people who could use it to defend themselves. Now, another pro-gun argument is something along the lines of, give everybody guns. That way, everybody has a means to protect themselves. If anything happens, then there'll be loads of people with the gun. There are numerous problems with this. One is that you can't force people to own guns. So you can't really rely on the idea that more people will buy, own, and carry guns with them. It's an unrealistic expectation. It also doesn't have the desired effect. If you go out and everybody else has guns, that's not necessarily going to make most people feel safe. That's going to make them feel threatened. In fact, that was a big point in some of these interventional programs that have been successful, making people feel safe without carrying a gun with them. That way, there were less people carrying guns and less gun violence. We're safer in a world that has less guns than in a world that has more guns. Now, another argument I've seen is simply pointing out particular instances where guns were used to protect. They point out instances of people's houses being broken into or robberies happening where guns were used as a defense. And they also point out instances where guns weren't used as a defense, but could have. This is cherry picking. I am by no means denying that guns can be used as a defense. I understand that they can be, and that they are. But the rate at which they are used for defense is not worth it, and there's less deaths the less guns there are. The rate of these instances happening actually decrease with gun control. Now notice what they don't do here. They don't point out all of the instances where people committed suicide with a gun. They don't do that because they're trying to appeal to emotion, which isn't objective. But it makes sense because, for the most part, it looks like their stance is formed on an emotional basis. But the thing is, we want the same things. Both the left and the right, we want our families to be safer. But it looks to me that those with less guns are far more safe than those with it. Now, especially considering the risks of suicide, having a gun in your house makes your home less safe. Now, if you are particularly concerned of your house being broken into, the best thing you can do is not live in a high-crime area. That's really it. Now, admittedly, that's easier said than done, but still, even in high-crime areas, having more guns in that area does not make that area safer. Now, that being said, people on the left, and who are pro-gun control, they have emotional arguments too. They have their stance based on emotion as well, and that shows in the fact that they give lots of attention to mass shootings, but not necessarily everyday homicide and suicide that happens far more often, as well as when they try to ban or restrict particular features of guns, or particular guns themselves. I mean, a pistol grip on a long gun isn't really making much of a difference, and those types of guns are used in sport and hunting. I mean, long guns in general aren't really that much of a problem. We really need to be focused on handguns because that accounts for way more of these incidents. And another thing that I totally forgot to film, I'm just now realizing how many mistakes I made while filming. But they also bring up the Second Amendment. But the Second Amendment doesn't say anybody can buy whatever guns they want. What the Second Amendment says is a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But what you forget is that the very first thing that is said is a well-regulated militia. The Second Amendment says that this should be regulated. We should stay on top of this. Now, what I'm proposing here isn't crazy. It's actually been done in every other country that's better than us. In fact, we are behind on this. I'm not saying that we should take all of your guns away, but I am saying that we need waiting periods. We need to require people to have a secure place to hold their guns, and we need more thorough background checks to make sure that people who are mentally ill and people who have a criminal record don't buy guns, because those are the people who are far more dangerous. I don't want people who have been criminally violent before to own guns, and I don't want people who have depression, say schizophrenia, psychosis, anxiety, what have you, to have a gun either, because I don't think those guns are in good hands. And the data shows that to be the case. Now, I hold a stricter stance in that I don't think that anybody who lives in the same house as somebody who has been criminally violent or who has been diagnosed with a variety of psychological issues should have a gun, so that the gun isn't in the hands of those who may have these problems. What I'm advocating for is restricting guns from people who are criminally violent and mentally ill. So it seems kind of telling when people are totally against gun control, totally against it, because it seems like either those are the people who should not have guns, being criminally violent or mentally ill, or they want those sorts of people to have guns. Now, feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but thank you for watching, and goodbye.